Welcome back, deep divers. Ready to get a little muddy?
Always up for an adventure.
Good, because today we're wading into the wild world of feral swine in Oregon.
Oh, yeah, this one's fascinating.
We've dug up this in-depth action plan from back in 2007, kind of a preemptive strike to tackle a problem that could have gotten seriously out of hand.
It's interesting, right? Like looking back at what they were anticipating back then.
Exactly. So first things first, when we say feral swine, what exactly are we talking about?
Okay, picture this. We're not just talking about a couple of farm pigs that, snuck out for an afternoon stroll. These are free-roaming, wild animals. From the sus genus, to be precise. Think truly untamed, unmanaged, not hanging out in a barn.
Got it. So truly wild.
Yeah, and their origin story is kind of interesting. They hail from Europe and Russia originally.
Okay.
But get this. They've basically hitched a ride with humans over centuries, and now you find them almost everywhere. Literally almost every continent except Antarctica.
Wow. So, globe-trotting pigs with a wild streak.
Yeah.
But why all the fuss? What makes these particular critters such a cause for concern?
Well, for starters, they are like the ultimate baby-making machines. Like, a female can start popping out piglets in under a year.
Seriously, under a year?
Yeah, and they can have, 2 litters a year.
Wow.
Each with, 10 to 12 piglets.
Oh, my goodness.
So do the math on that. And the other thing is they're not picky eaters, they'll eat pretty much anything. So that combo of crazy breeding and their ability to adapt to almost any environment, well, that makes them pretty formidable, right?
Yeah.
But here's the real kicker. Once they get a good foothold, a solid breeding population, it's incredibly tough to dislodge them.
So not just like a few extra pigs roaming around. This is like a genuine ecological threat we're talking about.
Right.
And this 2007 plan really leans on a pest risk assessment that was done for Oregon back in 2004. What were some of the big red flags that they raised back then?
Well, that 2004 assessment basically put feral swine in the very high-risk category for Oregon. And, they had their reasons. They were mainly worried about, well, first, the high chance of these pigs becoming a permanent fixture, like they could really establish themselves.
Right.
Second, they were concerned about the damage they could do. Not just to the environment, but also to the economy, to agriculture.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there's always the disease risk. They could spread diseases to our native wildlife, to livestock, even to humans.
So triple threat: environment, economy, and public health.
Yeah.
All on the line. And the economic impact isn't small potatoes either, is it? The report mentions a pretty staggering number nationwide.
Yeah, prepare yourself. Nationwide, the estimated damage from these feral swine is over $800 million every year.
$800 million.
Annually. And that's including the cost of trying to restore ecosystems, the losses for farmers, for ranchers. So for an initial investment of, a little over $1 million,
Yeah.
a tiny fraction of that Oregon was trying to, well, get ahead of this potential disaster, right?
$1 million to save potentially $800 million every year. That's a pretty good return on investment. Okay, let's get into the nitty-gritty. What kind of damage are these feral swine actually doing? Can you paint us a picture?
Sure. Imagine them as like little bulldozers. They're constantly rooting around, digging up the soil, making a mess.
Yeah.
And that, unfortunately, creates the perfect environment for invasive weeds to take hold.
Oh, I see.
They can completely change what types of plants dominate in an area, and they love munching on seedlings, so, young forests take a hit.
Oh, okay.
And then there's the soil erosion. They're really good at that, unfortunately. And the thing is, the report specifically points out that this weed spreading, erosion-causing behavior was already being observed in Oregon at the time.
So they were seeing the damage firsthand.
Yeah. And of course, there's the disease issue, always a fun topic. The report mentions that there hadn't been any direct transmission to humans in Oregon back in 2007, but then they brought up this really disturbing case from California.
Oh, yeah, the E. coli outbreak. I remember hearing
Yeah,
about
that was 2006. It was linked to spinach grown on a California farm, and tragically, 3 people died.
Oh, man.
But here's the thing. They did some genetic testing, and they traced the E. coli strain back to, you guessed it, feral swine droppings in those spinach fields.
Oh, wow. So a direct link.
Yeah, a pretty sobering reminder of the potential health risks, even if Oregon hadn't seen direct human transmission at that point.
So back in 2007, what was the actual situation on the ground in Oregon? Were feral swine already running rampant?
Not exactly. The report described the populations as small and scattered at that time.
Okay.
But, state and federal biologists we're definitely seeing the damage. It was already happening, like those weed and erosion issues we talked about.
So like small brush fires popping up across the state.
Yeah, and the worry was, those small fires could become a massive wildfire if they didn't do something.
Okay, that brings us to the core of this deep dive. This 2007 report laid out a plan to, well, nip this in the bud. What were the main strategies they proposed to stop a full-scale feral swine invasion, and why did they push so hard for complete eradication as the only viable solution?
Right. So the report looked at three ways to deal with this. Management, trying to control things long term. Then control, which is more about reducing numbers in specific areas.
Okay.
And finally, eradication, going for the full wipeout.
No more pigs.
Exactly. And they looked at what had happened in other places.
Okay.
Places like California, Australia, Hawaii, the Galapagos, the Channel Islands, they were all grappling with this. And the evidence was overwhelming. Only eradication efforts, like really committed ones, had actually managed to make a serious dent.
So just, hunting them here and there or putting up a fence that's not really going to cut it in the long run?
Right. The report basically said those management and control tactics might buy you some time, maybe protect a specific area for a bit, but they're not going to stop those initial populations from, ballooning into something unmanageable.
Okay.
And that's why they came out so strongly in favor of a full-on 4-year eradication plan for Oregon. Go big or go home,
A
right?
bold move.
Yeah.
So let's break down this eradication plan. What were the key steps they laid out?
Okay, the plan had 4 major components. The first one they called source control.
Yeah.
Basically, this was about making sure no new feral swine were getting into the wild.
Right, shutting off the tap.
Exactly. They wanted new laws to stop people from intentionally releasing domestic pigs and to prevent accidental escapes from farms.
Makes sense.
They also wanted to make it easier to remove feral swine, whether they were on public or private land, and this is a big one, they proposed mandatory ear tags for all domestic swine.
Ear tags.
Yeah.
I'm intrigued. How would that help with the feral pig problem?
Well, think of it this way. If every farm pig had a unique, easily visible ear tag with a registration number tied to its owner, it would be super simple to tell the difference between, Farmer John's pig that wandered off and a truly wild feral pig.
Ah, smart. So you can easily tell who's who.
Right, and the report even dug into existing Oregon laws like ORS 496.004. That law already defined feral swine as wildlife, but the problem was, how do you enforce those restrictions on releasing domestic animals if you can't even tell if a pig is feral or not?
Right.
The ear tag solves that.
Makes sense. It's like a pig passport.
Exactly. And the report also mentioned how feral swine were already classified in ways that were supposed to make them easier to control. Like back in 2001, they updated ORS 601 to specifically list feral swine as unprotected wildlife.
Okay.
And then they were also labeled as predators under ORS 610.002. So basically, they were making it easier for people to hunt and remove them.
Okay.
But the report also talked about this other law, ORS 570.405, which allows for the creation of these eradication zones. But here's the catch. You have to go through this whole public hearing process, which can take months. And for a small, fast-moving group of pigs, well, that's just not fast enough.
Right. They could be long gone by the time the paperwork's done.
Exactly. It's like trying to hit a moving target with, a really slow arrow. And the report really emphasizes how far these pigs can travel. They said a typical feral swine might have a home range of, about a square mile.
Okay.
A wild boar, even bigger, like 2.5 square miles.
So they can cover some ground.
Yeah, but here's the crazy part. When things get tough, like during droughts or food shortages, those ranges can expand like crazy, like up to 20 times bigger. So we're talking like almost 20 square miles.
Oh, wow. It's a lot of ground to cover.
Right. And it shows how important that rapid response is. You can't be messing around with bureaucratic delays.
Makes sense. Strike while the iron's hot. And those ear tags they were proposing, those are pretty specific, weren't they?
Yeah, they had a clear vision. They wanted brightly colored tags, something you couldn't miss, on the ears of all domestic swine over 20 pounds.
Okay.
Each tag would have a unique number linked to the owner.
Like a pig license plate.
Exactly. And they even suggested, why not just do the tagging during routine vet checks, make it easy.
Yes, streamline the process.
And importantly, they said Oregon should update or create new laws that would make these tags mandatory and allow for immediate removal of any untagged swine found on public or private land. They even compared it to how the state manages noxious weeds, under ORS 570.510, you find a noxious weed, you pull it, you find an untagged pig, same deal.
Okay, so task 1, cut off the source. What was the next step?
Task 2 was all about gathering intel and getting the public on board. They called it population assessment and public education.
Okay.
The first goal was to create a centralized database at the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, ODFW. This database would track where feral swine populations were, how big they were, and what efforts were being made to control them.
So like a central command for pig tracking.
Exactly. And they also wanted to reach out to other state and federal agencies, see what data they had.
Okay.
Like, had they been tracking any sightings, any damage reports, any removal efforts over the past 5 years? Get the full picture.
So a statewide pig census, basically.
Pretty much. And the public education piece of this was huge. The report emphasized that agencies like ODFW, the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, APHIS, and the Oregon Department of Agriculture, ODA, they all rely heavily on reports from regular folks, people out in the field.
Citizen scientists.
Exactly, because those people are often the first to notice something's up. So educating people about the threat, encouraging them to report any sightings, any damage, that was seen as crucial for getting a handle on the situation.
Right, because if you don't know where they are, you can't really do anything about it.
Exactly. And also, an informed public is much more likely to support those long-term eradication efforts. It's about getting everyone on the same page.
Makes sense. A united front against the pigs. So what kind of outreach did they have in mind?
Well, they suggested a lot of things, like giving talks to hunter associations,
Okay.
holding discussions with farmers, livestock owners, putting up flyers and signs at, trailheads, campgrounds, places where people are out in nature,
Right.
and working with the Oregon Invasive Species Council, leveraging their existing outreach programs. They even highlighted the successful eradication effort near Post, Oregon. Apparently, local knowledge was key in that case.
Makes sense. The people who are out there all the time are going to be the first to notice something unusual. So we've got a plan to stop new pigs from coming in.
Right.
We're getting a clearer picture of where the existing ones are, what's next, the actual removal.
You got it. Task 3 was all about eradication.
Okay, let's hear it.
The idea was to divide Oregon into 3 zones based on the type of habitat. Zones 1 and 2 were mainly open terrain, so, easier to access. They figured they'd have more success there initially, kind of like what they saw in that Post example.
Yeah.
And Zone 3 was mostly dense forest, so, trickier to navigate. They plan to tackle that one later.
So prioritize the areas where they have the best chance of success, then move on to the tougher spots.
Exactly. And they wanted to set up a rapid response system for any new sightings.
Okay.
This would involve having contracts with USDA Wildlife Services so they could deploy teams anywhere in the state year-round.
Like a pig SWAT team.
Kind of, yeah. And when it came to actually removing the pigs, they emphasized using every tool in the toolbox.
Okay.
So ground hunting with trained dogs,
Okay.
aerial hunting from helicopters, and trapping.
Oh, wow. So going all out.
Yeah, the report said most successful eradications use a combination of techniques. You got to adapt to the specific situation.
It's not a one-size-fits-all approach.
Right. And they also acknowledged that the timeline for eradication would vary depending on the size and the location of the pig population.
Okay.
A large, well-established group might require setting up a whole control area and could take multiple breeding seasons to wipe out. But they also emphasized that not every effort would be that long, especially with a strong, rapid response in place.
So some battles might be quick, some might be marathon.
Right, exactly.
Okay, we've got source control, population assessment, eradication. What's the final piece?
The last step is all about making sure the pigs don't stage a comeback. They called it monitoring and assessment.
Oh.
They were very clear that even after you remove all the pigs from an area, they can reappear, or new ones can be introduced. And this can happen quickly, like within 6 months to a year.
Wow, so you got to be vigilant.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So ongoing monitoring is essential to make sure the eradication holds. This means physically checking the areas for any signs of pig activity, talking to local residents, seeing if they've noticed anything. They recommended mandatory monitoring of each eradication zone for at least 2 years after the last removal. And only after 2 years with no confirmed signs, no pigs in sight, would they consider the eradication a success.
2 years of pig-free living, that's the goal. Now, this all sounds like a pretty big undertaking. What did the report say about the cost?
Yeah, they estimated the total cost for the whole 4-year plan to be $1.29 million.
Okay.
And then they projected an ongoing cost of less than $50,000 per year for follow-up control, dealing with any new releases or escapes, but that didn't include emergency response costs.
So a million and a bit up front and then 50,000 a year for maintenance.
Yeah.
Compared to that potential 800 million in annual damage nationwide, that seems like a pretty good deal.
Right, exactly. And they really emphasized that in the report. They said, look, Oregon's agriculture and livestock industries are worth $3.6 billion.
Wow.
And we're spending all this money restoring riparian areas.
Right.
What's the point if those investments are just going to be wiped out by these pigs?
Right, it's penny wise and pound foolish.
Exactly. Spend a little now to save a lot later.
So how was that $1.29 million budget broken down?
Well, the biggest chunk was for the actual eradication contracts, paying the people doing the removal.
Okay.
They were going to focus on zones 1 and 2 first, remember the more accessible areas, and then move on to zone 3.
Right.
They also budgeted for a dedicated half-time program manager at ODFW to oversee the whole thing: travel costs, the ear tag program, education and outreach materials, those rapid response contracts with USDA Wildlife Services. They even included an estimate for the cost per pig removed in those initial, less dense populations, which they said was around $400 to $500 based on earlier efforts and some research.
Okay, so a detailed plan, a clear budget, and a sense of urgency. Looking back at this 2007 report, what are the key takeaways?
I think the main message is that feral swine were, and likely still are, a serious threat to Oregon, on multiple fronts. And this action plan was a smart move. Prioritizing eradication was the right call.
Right, go for the knockout punch.
Exactly. And they weren't messing around. They proposed a multi-pronged approach, addressing every aspect of the problem.
Right, a holistic strategy.
And the other big takeaway is the importance of being proactive. Learning from the mistakes of others, from past efforts, and taking decisive action early on before the problem spirals out of control.
Right, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And they really hammered that point home with all those case studies from other regions. They show that once you have a full-blown feral swine invasion, it's incredibly difficult and expensive to deal with.
Absolutely. And this 2007 plan really serves as a reminder that, when it comes to invasive species, early intervention is key. It might seem like a big investment up front, but in the long run, it's way more effective and way cheaper than trying to play catch-up later.
It's like dealing with a leak, right? A little drip now can turn into a burst pipe later on if you ignore it. And that brings us to a question for you, the listener. We've talked a lot about the technical aspects of this eradication plan, the laws, the budgets, the strategies. But what role do you think public awareness and individual responsibility play in all of this? Could a plan like this succeed without the support and cooperation of everyday people? That's something for you to ponder. Thanks for diving deep with us.